What is up, everybody? It's Dr. Vibe here, host and producer of the award-winning Dr. Vibe show, the home of epic conversations, and this is the place for epic conversations. And I am the 2018 recipient of the Innovation Award from the Canadian Ethnic Media Association, and this is the home of epic conversations, and I'm the host of Epic Conversations. Have you ever in your life had someone you really want to get to do something? And you just keep persistent and consistent? Well, if you can relate to that, this individual is one of those people in my life, Andray Domise. I've been wanting to have him on the Dr. Vibe show for, it was 2 years, maybe?
I think the first time he asked me was like 5 years ago, to be honest.
5 years, okay.
Yeah.
5 years ago. And I just said, no problem, everything will work out. And then a few months ago, we were on a panel together. Mm-hmm. And he said, "You're Dr. Vibe?" Yes, I'm Dr. Vibe.
Well, because they listed you by name, and I only knew you as Dr. Vibe.
Dr. Vibe. So we keep the name off. They only knew me as Dr. Vibe. And it was a panel about fathers loving their sons. And it was an incredible panel. And the driver of this conversation was Andray Domise, and he did an incredible job. And I said to him, one day you're going to come on, and when the time is right, I just accept him where he is. Now, here's a little secret of Dr. Vibe. He reaches out to people on long weekends, and it just happened to be a long weekend. And actually, about last week, and we sort of went back and forth. I said, okay. And I didn't know up until a few minutes that he would still make it, because he's got a wonderful family, a wonderful wife, and twins. So give love to the brother that he makes time to share with us. And plus, he's a contributing editor for Maclean's magazine in Canada. And if you don't know about Maclean's, it is Canada's national current affairs and news magazine since 1905. 1905. And there's a recent article, or not an article, but there's a recent, how can I put it? Poll.
You can say essay. Oh, yeah, the poll.
The recent survey done by the Ecos Research Associates saying that about 40% of Canadians feel that there are too many immigrants coming to Canada. Now, I am very blessed because I have a worldwide audience, and a lot of people say, oh, Canada's such a beautiful country, and we're so accepting. So when I saw this, and I saw Andray was on one of the conversations about this already, I said, let me see if we can get him on, and he can give some reality and truth when it comes to immigration in Canada. So we'd like to say, after 5 years, welcome for the first time and not the last time to the Dr. Vibe show, Andray Domise. How are you, sir?
I'm good. Greatly blessed, highly favored, happy to be here, and good talking to you again. Always
a pleasure. And I know your time is limited, so I want, if you can, just give a little short background about yourself to the audience.
Yeah, so I'm a contributing editor with Maclean's magazine, which is one of Canada's magazines of record. I'm also a regular contributor to the Globe and Mail, occasional contributor to Vice Canada, etc. I don't make a career out of writing to be, a prestigious journalist. I write basically as therapy. Like, I have thoughts and feelings and information and everything all bound up inside. And luckily I have very friendly editors-in-chief who say, absolutely, whatever you got, lay it on us. And this is how I end up writing essays. So I generally tend to stay away from, trying to be part of the media conversation on things like race, immigration, et cetera. Like, I don't actively seek that out. Generally, I try to do my work inside of the community. And when what I'm seeing inside of the community and what's happening in the media are at odds, that's usually when I write something to try and clarify. So that's what I did where it comes to the conversation about immigration in Canada, is that the conversation I see happening in the media and politically is just not comporting with the actual facts. And I think politicians and the media do I would say, like, a generally poor job of explaining what essential value that immigration has to Canada, which is why we see a rising sentiment of anti-immigration feelings among people who would call themselves Canadians.
Excellent. How did you get to the status of where you were? And congratulations, by the way. I think it's absolutely outstanding. Was it an easy road to get to where you're at now?
No. You know what? I would say I benefited from not going the J school route. My background was I was a poli-sci major in university after.
Same here.
And there's a lot of us who are that end up not getting jobs or doing further education inside of poli-sci. I actually went into the financial industry. So I worked as a financial advisor and then a financial planner for a number of years. But I just felt like a disconnect between what it was that I was doing for a living and, what I see happening in my community. I ran for city council in 2014. 2014. It ended up being against Rob Ford. And obviously I did not win. But while I was campaigning, I did write a couple of essays talking about the disparity between how the media portrays the Ford family in relation to the Caribbean community, and then what the actual effects that their policies have on the community. And I think when people saw that, like, oh my gosh, a black person from Rexdale is writing this about Rob Ford, excuse me. And I think that's kind of what led into my writing projects. And I will say, I think some of that is the burden of lowered expectations. Like, people sort of automatically assume that if you're not part of academia, if you're not part of the media world, then you almost don't have a voice. So I think at least what I hope to do in my writing is show people that you don't really have to, like, you don't have to come from this track. You don't have to, be a J school student. You don't have to be an academic. You can describe the world around you in your own voice, and there's a place for you in the conversation.
Excellent. Well, let's get right to the conversation at hand. When you saw the results of this survey, did it catch you off guard?
No, it didn't catch me off guard. I think what it did, when we say the survey, we're referring to the poll released by ACOS, which is a polling agency in Canada. So for your listeners outside, it would be like a Gallup poll or the Geo polls, any of those large polling agencies. So for the first, at least the president of ECHO's polling, Frank Graves, said that for the first time in the 25 years they've been tracking this, they found that the majority of Canadian voters have a feeling that there are, disregarding the total amount of immigrants that are coming into the country, how do you feel about the visible minorities who are immigrating here? Do you feel that there are too few, too many, or just right? And they, on their polling page, which I hope you'll include in the show notes, they broke it down, like they disaggregated the data. So they didn't just show, how many Canadians feel a certain way about immigration. They also showed by province. So for the provinces that they were able to poll, and the N value was high enough that they could actually include it in the poll, it turns out that Alberta is the most intolerant towards visible minorities as immigrants, which is not very surprising if you follow what's been happening with the Alberta election. The United Conservative Party, who just recently won that election, the number of candidates that they fielded who had ties to white supremacist organizations and had expressed not just anti-immigrant feelings, but also were spreading white nationalist talking points on their Facebook pages, etc. So that's not entirely surprising. But then they also tracked it by political affiliation. So if you're a liberal, it turns out that you feel that the amount of immigrants that are coming into Canada who are visible minorities, well, it's the just right amount. Like this is the amount that we're taking in. For the most part, they were saying this is perfect. 19% of them said that there were too many, but there was a much larger proportion that were saying either it's just right or there's too few. What was kind of surprising, I think to most people, was that the NDP, which is Canada's closest thing that we have to a Labour Party, but not quite. They're still sort of like that left centrist vote. It was something to the order of 29% of them. So basically almost a third feel that there are too many immigrants. Same thing for the Green Party. And the Green Party actually has an international charter. So they're not just a national organization. The Green Party is an international political party. And in their charter, tolerance and diversity actually happens to be a part of their charter. But the Green Party, out of all these sort of like progressive left type parties, they had the highest. It was, I believe, 38%. The Conservatives, however, 71% of Conservatives feel that there are too many visible minorities who are immigrating to this country, which should surprise approximately nobody. But it does say that there's a conversation to be had on how the conversation, like the way that the media frames the question of immigration, has mostly been focused through the lens of asylum seeking. That is, people who come into this country, for if they were coming outside of the ports of entry, if they were coming, through, say, Roxham Road, which is an avenue in Quebec from the United States that goes into Canada, were essentially people who come here seeking asylum, but were residents of the United States first. If they go to a port of entry, i.e. the Niagara Falls border, they will be turned away because the U.S. is designated as a safe third country. Between Nigeria and Canada, if they've immigrated here through the United States, they'll say, well, you should file for asylum in the United States. On the other hand, if you go through a place that's not a port of entry, so if you're not landing in an airport, you're not going through the border, but you're going through this basically side avenue, you can come into the country and claim asylum once you're here. And the thing is, that's actually international law. Like, any asylum seeker should be able to come here and file for asylum regardless of how they got here. So when media frames them as quote unquote illegals, they're very aware. Like, I'm pretty sure that people working in national news agencies are aware that laws exist that allow for asylum seekers to come here through irregular avenues, but they would rather call them illegals because they want to frame it as though there's something wrong with what they're doing. What they've also done is frame it as they're jumping the queue, i.e. for somebody who files immigration papers to come here from, say, Sweden or Norway, to come here from Russia, etc., that there's an application process. There's a determination as to whether they would be a positive contribution to the country. If they are, they're able to come in. If they're not, then their application is rejected. But then asylum seekers are doing something that's more dastardly. They're coming here and they're jumping ahead of the line, ahead of all these valid applicants who are trying to come here through immigration, except there isn't a queue where it comes to asylum seeking. There's no queue for refugees. You get here, you file for asylum, and if you're approved, you stay. If you're not, you're deported. So because we've collapsed this multitude of issues into the concept of illegal immigrants, Canadians are generally turning on their television, and the immigration conversation happens to be centered around generally Black people who are coming up here through Quebec. Mostly of Somali, mostly of Nigerian background, etc. So when people think immigration, they're thinking about those illegal immigrants. The problem is Canada has no ability right now to replace itself through a Canadian-born population. So there aren't enough people being born in Canada to replace the population that's dying. As a matter of fact, the government of Canada and several other agencies have already projected that I believe it's by 2034, if immigration was to stop, say, tomorrow, by 2034, there would be more people dying in this country than people that are being born. So with that upside down pyramid, what you have is pressures on the labor force to sustain social services for people that are either retiring or people that are passing away out of this earth. So, healthcare, welfare, Canada Pension Plan, every other social service that's provided for people who are of an advanced age, the pressure would be so intense on the workforce that they wouldn't be able to make up with it for their taxes, which means that the government would then have to raise taxes, and not just on workers, but on everybody, which means that corporate taxes are going up, retail sales taxes, et cetera, are going up. With the drastic increase in tax revenue that the government would have to collect to provide for the upside down pyramid, businesses, at least according to the Conference Board of Canada, businesses would look at that and say, why would we open up business in this country? They would simply forego investment inside of Canada. So what you have is, for example, auto plants, agricultural industries, and basically international agencies or international companies that work here that have Canadian operations would pull up stakes and go where it's cheaper. So this is like incredibly mundane to talk about, right? The cause, the effects, the hypotheses, and all that stuff. It's incredibly mundane to talk about, which is why you generally don't hear it in the media. What's sensational, what gets people to click on ads, what gets people to turn on the news and stay watching is this conversation about illegals. But all this other unsexy stuff about why it's necessary to have immigration into this country, because we require immigrants to create a labor force growth, because people aren't doing that, and also because they're not explaining what it is that has people who immigrate come here. Without framing that conversation properly, the only people who are left to frame the conversation are the 71% of conservatives who don't want people immigrating here. So they basically abandoned the high ground on this conversation to the people who have bad faith at heart. So the reason I wrote the article, what I was trying to get at is we need to, reframe how this conversation is had. I'm not saying that, my article is going to change everybody's minds. I'm saying this is possibly a good first step. Frame the conversation in terms of what benefit does it have to Canadians if we have a healthy amount of immigrants who are coming here. According to the Conference Board of Canada, according to the Government of Canada, that number is somewhere at around 1.3% of the population, which is why we have a number of 350,000 by the year 2021. The government wants 350,000 immigrants per year coming here. Do you know what percentage of that 350,000 is going to be accounted for by refugees? 5%. Wow. So when we talk about this immigrant crisis, only 5% of the total amount of refugees would be accounted for through asylum seeking. We had just under 20,000 people in the year 2018, that's last year, just under 20,000 people filed for asylum. That was actually lower than the year before. But if you listen to the news, they make it seem as though like, well, every immigrant is coming into this country and we have no place for them. I mean, Germany, it's like more than twice that number. Germany is a country that's like 1/8 our size. So, and Canada can reasonably handle about 10 times its population in this country. We're not an overcrowded nation by any stretch. So let's not, fearmonger. Let's not get into some like really weird ideas about what refugees are going to do once they get here. Let's stick to the facts. And I think, it's been really hard watching the way that politicians and generally the media will frame this conversation because it's hardly fact-based at all. So that's why I wrote what I wrote.
Excellent. Just want to shout out to the audience, people who jumped in. Nazim, this is here from Italy, and he makes the comment, Italy has the same problem, but the current government has a totally insane and inhuman non-migrant policy in place. Mm-hmm. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the room because we have people in from the United States, from Italy, and if anyone wants to come in and join the conversation with Andray and myself, please feel free. You know how I roll. Andray, how much do you feel, and I'll say this sarcastically, our neighbor from the South has to do with, you feel, the current sentiment, the sentiment that results in this poll?
I would say that it's a mistake to blame everything on the United States. Obviously, the U.S. does exercise an outsized influence. They have a degree of political hegemony and a degree of media hegemony that bleeds over into Canada. So it's not to say that they don't play a factor in this at all, but this is a global phenomenon. I mean, if you turn on RT, that is the news agency of record in Russia. If you turn on Sky News, like you'll see this conversation being had just about everywhere in the world. So basically, Western nations, as I would say as a whole, are generally pessimistic towards immigration. And the problem, again, with the way that it's framed, is that they eschew their responsibility for what creates the conditions by which migrants are seeking asylum in Western countries in the first place. So what I tried to do in the article, and I'm not like an expert in geopolitics. I would say fairly well read, but by no means am I an expert. But I think I was able to create the broad strokes of, okay, what is it that the conflict in Somalia was about? Because when we read about migrants, refugees, etc., we generally in Western media accept chaos and conflict as just the natural state of order in Middle Eastern and in African nations. It's just a cultural shorthand. So when we talk about people coming here from Somalia and fleeing a civil war, we don't talk about, well, what is it that creates the conditions in Somalia by which a civil war has to happen in the first place? And to do that, you have to go all the way back to the late 1800s in the scramble for Africa. And the thing is, nobody really wants to put in that kind of work. You know what I'm saying? So to have a conversation, at least to have a reasonable conversation on why it is that there was a wave of immigrants that came here from Somalia in the 1990s, then you have to go back to Mohammed Siad Barre's government and the Ogaden War. You have to understand how it is that the Somali military was almost completely wiped out at the hands of Ethiopia, which was backed by the Eastern Bloc, backed by Russia, backed by several communist nations. How is it that the 1991 Civil War began in the first place? Well, you have to go back to the 1970, I believe, 78 coup d'état that weakened Barre's position. You have to go back to the vision of Greater Somaliland. Nobody does that, and I think part of the reason for that is because no one wants to have a conversation about the responsibility that Britain and Italy have for basically carving up a piece of land. Telling all of its inhabitants that essentially, like, your clan differences don't really matter to us. What matters is that we own this land now. And then pulling up stakes and leaving. You have to have a conversation about, well, how is it that the Cold War created the Horn of Africa as essentially like a strategic choke point. Because we don't have those fulsome conversations, what we're left with is this is just the natural state of things. Instead of going into that really boring and dry and archaic history to say, well, what responsibility do Western nations have to countries that they formerly colonized, pulled up stakes, left behind, and did not create an infrastructure by which those countries could have self-determination. Without that, then you can't understand why the family of Ahmed Hussein, who is now Canada's immigration minister, you can't really understand why they fled Mogadishu, why he would go to Kenya, why he ends up in Hamilton, Ontario, graduates school here, goes on to law school for the purpose of bolstering his community organization skills, to represent immigrants, to represent refugees in the court of law, and then go on to become Canada's immigration minister later. Like, he has not just like literally decades worth of experience, but he's also got a lifetime of lived experience to understand what the process is that creates refugees in the first place. And there are very valid criticisms. I'm not saying that, I'm his biggest fan. I'm definitely not. But what you have in opposition to an Ahmed Hussein, Canada's immigration minister, are people that don't have experience in managing immigration policy, people that do not have experience working with refugees. So you have a Michelle Rempel, who's the MP for, I believe it's Calgary Nose Hill. So you have like a Michelle Rempel that's a big-time immigration critic, and essentially, gets on Twitter, gets in front of TV cameras, and then lies about asylum seekers, lies and calls them illegal immigrants. You have like a Doug Ford government in Ontario, Canada, who, they will lie about asylum seekers putting pressure on Canada's, or Ontario's at least, on our social housing system, a social housing system that's been neglected for just about my entire adult life. You have
absolutely.
You have people that will basically just get in front of a camera, get on the Twitter, and completely lie, have no experience, and yet we weigh the experience and education, which is practically none, of complete liars against somebody who has experience and a lifetime of work in this area, and say, pick and choose. We got to hear both sides. That's completely ridiculous. We would never, you would never put up, an educated economist against somebody who's, read the business section of the newspaper. You would never put them up head to head and say, you got to hear both sides. That's insane. But when it comes to the immigration conversation, nobody's an expert. That's what bothers me.
Okay. Well, ask and we shall receive. I asked some people if they want to come in, and Fraser is in from Scotland. And certainly, Fraser, thanks for stopping by. What do you have to add to the conversation, or any questions you have for Andray?
Well, regarding immigration, obviously immigration in the UK, now we've had a big issue in that. Now, one thing, my bee in my bonnet is, now Scotland, we're under the Scottish government, we're under the UK government, but there's the Scottish government as well. And as much as we all
only for so much longer, by the way, I'm following very closely what's going on over there. So.
Sorry, I cannot stand.
That's another conversation. Another conversation.
But my point is, in immigration, the SNP were happy to let refugees in from Syria and all that when all the problem was going. And what my point is, but at the end of the day, who pays for them? It's the taxpayer. When there's people like veterans, people who have served for your country, who are literally abandoned, and people who have gone, hey, come and serve, come and join the army, come and serve, come and fight for your country. But when you come out of the army, what do you get? You get basically dropped from a great height, and you don't really care. But there's always money available to house refugees and give them a nice home, roof over their heads. Not a problem, but there's veterans or people who have served for the country who are on the street, who have nothing. So what my point is why I don't get, it's bonkers. We welcome, come and bring refugees in, but people who serve get nothing. They might as well just be put out with the trash.
I will say that we have a similar conversation happening over here, and I find it interesting that people only seem to remember that veterans exist the moment that asylum seekers appear in the news again. I was like, oh my gosh! All of a sudden, we got to do something for the veterans. I'm not saying that you don't care. What I'm saying though is that this talking point seems to come up fairly often. Here's my point of view on that: is this? I don't. Although I do have a problem with militarism, I do also understand how the military industry essentially preys on low-income people, preys on basically the working class to say, well, we're going to give you, an education. We'll put a roof over your head. We'll put you up. We'll give you benefits if you basically, you'll go and fight for your country. Once they're out of the military, then there's nothing left over for them. So I see that as a working class problem. I don't necessarily see that as a militarism problem, because there are reasons why people get in the first place. That being said, I don't really understand why we can't do both. Like, people seem to believe that asylum seekers are just, leeching off of the system, that everything is being taken care of for them. And it's not. They don't necessarily have immediate access to the healthcare system. They don't have immediate access to education. They don't have any immediate access to daycare and so forth. Provinces basically lay the rules out according to how they see fit. In Quebec, for example, I'm pretty sure it was that it was last year that they decided to cut subsidies for daycares for people who are asylum seekers here. So there's, I think, people who make this argument that asylum seekers are getting everything and veterans are getting nothing need to be a little bit better educated about what benefits asylum seekers are actually entitled to. That being said, what responsibility Scotland being part of the UK, as you've already established, then what responsibility does the UK have to recompense the people whose nations that they've essentially wrecked and left behind? What responsibility do they have to people seeking from those nations for a better life? Just the same way that you can't basically airdrop an enlisted military member into some other country, expect them to fight, and when they come back, you provide them nothing whatsoever. But what about the people that lived in the lands that those military members were airdropped into? What responsibility do you have to them? What responsibility do you have to what you formally colonized? Personally, I believe that there is a responsibility. For example, when I've seen this conversation had in France as well, that we're not providing enough for homeless people, we're not providing enough for veterans, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Except France, up until not very long ago, was receiving reparations payments from Haiti, a country that they colonized, and the Haitian nation experienced a gigantic debt repayment that essentially hobbled their economy for over a century, that caused them to completely miss out on post-World War II prosperity that most of the rest of the Western world was able to take advantage of, because they were making these huge reparations payments to France, and they were making those reparations payments to compensate former slave owners. They essentially paid to free themselves. So I find it bizarre that countries that essentially extracted resources, wrecked economies, destroyed peoples, genocided entire cultures, can then turn around and say, well, we don't have a responsibility to do anything for you at all. Actually, you do. So again, we can't take the current conversation and uproot it from historical context and say, well, this is a worthwhile conversation to have. You can't. You have to talk about the conditions that create asylum seekers.
I would say in general in the UK we do have we do have a problem, because we have a standard open. They currently have an open border policy, hence why we want to get out of the EU. And hence why I'm kind of supporting the Brexit Party by Nigel Farage, which has been started up. And I think at the end of the day, Britain needs to get rid of a two-party system, and we need to, at the end of the day, SNP, we can't, SNP are just keep bumping the gums regarding being in Europe or being independent. I don't want that. I want to be out of Europe but stay as UK, because UK are more powerful as a whole than separate countries, and Scotland would just collapse as if we did become independent.
I mean, I have no opinion on that whatsoever. I mean, the conversation, it's all good. The conversation I came in here for was regarding, how Canadian sentiment towards refugees. I will say though, based on what the gentleman just said, that the UK is stronger on its own, and Scotland is stronger as part of the UK. I'm not going to say that's invalid. I don't live in Scotland. I don't have any skin in the game there, so it's not my place to say whether that's correct or not. I guess what I will say is that the UK has a gigantic debt to settle with Anglophone Africa. And the idea that asylum seekers who are coming from, formerly colonized nations out of Africa to seek a better life in the UK, you have a debt towards them, whether you want to acknowledge that or not.
No problem. Our time is running out really fast, so I want to get onto this. How do you feel the thoughts of Canadians is going to impact the upcoming federal election in October?
Well, okay, here's what bugs me. Here's what bugs me about this conversation. So I've seen Trudeau and the Liberals essentially adopt a line of attack towards the sheer Conservatives, I think this poll provided for them a curse in the form of a blessing. Like it was like the monkey's one finger on the monkey's paw closing. So they see this poll, they see that 71% of conservatives believe that too many visible minority immigrants are here. Now, I want to clarify something here. There's no way that the average person opening up a newspaper and looking at this immigration conversation has any way of knowing how many visible minorities are coming here. As I clarified in my article, Canada doesn't actually track immigration by ethnic identification. We track immigration by country of origin. So, for example, UK, which is one of Canada's top 5 nations, from which people are immigrating. If somebody comes from the UK, you have no idea what their background is. They could be a Nigerian person from the UK, or a person of Nigerian background. They could be a person of Jamaican background coming from the UK. As a matter of fact, a good friend of mine, who works over here in the gaming industry, actually is from the UK and is of Nigerian background. So you have no idea. But say somebody coming out of Jamaica, you don't know what their ethnic background is either. They could be a Chinese Jamaican. They could be a Jamaican of white British background. You don't know that. The second thing is that Canada doesn't have an overwhelming amount of people coming from one particular nation. So if you look at, let's say, immigration into Australia, then the overwhelming majority of people that are immigrating into Australia are actually coming from the UK. The majority of people that are coming in, plurality of people that are coming into the United States, they come from Mexico. So you can possibly make a guess as to what their ethnic identification is. But in Canada, you have no way of knowing, which means when people look at total immigration numbers and they say there's too many visible minorities coming here, they're not basing that on any quantifiable information at all. They're basing it on their gut feeling. And their gut feeling is generally shaped by the media. So it essentially becomes a pull on racism. And I think what Justin Trudeau, his line of attack here is that if 71% of conservatives believe that there are too many visible minorities coming here, they must therefore be racist. And because Andrew Scheer, the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, has been associated with people, there's a member of, or I shouldn't say staff member, but there's somebody who's been associated with the party at a very high level that has a background working with Rebel Media, which is Canada's basically like alt-right, Breitbart-like publication. So the line of attack here is going, well, you have people who either aren't white nationalists, people are associated with white nationalists, and this is the effect that it's having on your party, therefore your party is racist. Okay, but what's that going to solve? If you call another party racist, if you call the leader of the party racist, or if you believe that members of the party are racist, what does that change whatsoever? Because now you're having a conversation whether they're racist or not. Nobody cares. I don't care whether people believe that they're racist, and you're going to have a very hard time convincing them they are racist. Nobody ever wants to cop to that. So the way to have the conversation is to explain the benefits of people immigrating here, and also to clarify, we don't really know what their background is. To say that there are too many visible minorities coming here is a problem in the Canadian polity. How do we fix that? But when you make the leader of the opposing party the face of racism in this country, I got bad news for you. The New Democratic Party tried to do that in Alberta. The New Democratic Party lost.
We got beat up.
Yeah. In every writing. Just like if you look at the map of Alberta in the election, it went from orange, which is the NDP color, it went from orange to blue, except in like one little tiny place, which is well, I shouldn't say tiny, but if you look at the map, it's like a dot on the map that's orange. That's in Edmonton. Edmonton was like their stronghold, but the rest of the province went blue. Adopting a tactic of just attacking the other party as racist does not work unless you can materially explain these are not invaders. These are not people who have no right to be here. These are not people that are trying to take something from you. As a matter of fact, they're your peers. If you want to retire one day, they're providing the labor and the taxes that's going to enable you to retire. These are people who live next door to you. These are people whose kids go to the same school that your kids do. These are people with the very same interests at heart for this country. They're your peers. They're your coworkers. They're members of your class. They support you the very same way you support them. If you have that conversation, I think you can change people's minds, especially when we are in an environment where people are I'm not going to say that, I'm not going to try and pull the whole economic anxiety excuse. But what I will say is that throughout history, like this is not disputable, whenever the working class finds itself under intense pressure, what they will generally do is start attacking each other rather than attacking the power structure that is applying that pressure. Austerity in Britain leads to Brexit. Like it's always a straight line. And to try to tell people in that working class that they're just imagining things and things are going to get better one day, and there's a new population that's coming in, and essentially, the people in that class are seeing them as competition for the already pressed labor market, then yeah, racism is going to come out. Try having informed, polite, and intense conversations with that working class, and I think things will change. But what we're seeing right now is, rather than account for the fact that there were several promises that this government made that they never came through on, and the fact that there are people, especially in the prairie provinces, the oil-producing provinces, that are under incredible pressure because the oil economy has all but collapsed, try to explain to them that they're racist, rather than explaining to them that things need to change at a structural and a corporate level. Well, we'll see the exact same result that happened in Alberta be replicated nationwide. That's my point of view.
Okay, well, we have unfortunately run out of time because Andray's schedule is a very tight one. So any final words you'd like to share with us in regards to this issue? And I hope we can get you back at another day. Andray has a lot of strong and powerful thoughts on a lot of different subjects, so we hope to have him back. No, and I'm saying that
was a very polite. That was a polite way of calling me a hot take machine.
No, I don't think you are. But I know. Everyone has their own. But understood. I did put the link in the chat on the side for the article, and when I repost this, I'll repost the conversation. Plus, I'll repost the article with it, so people can look deeper into it. Any last comments you'd like to have before we let you go, sir?
No, one thing that happened as feedback from the article is a lot of people who have written emails to me and people who've tweeted at me, etc., say that, oh, well, whose mind do you expect to change calling them racist? And I'm like, I didn't call anybody a racist. I said that the Echoes poll, because of the way that it was formed and because of the way that people don't have anything to quantify their feelings, it essentially becomes a litmus test on racism. If it doesn't apply, let it fly. But I find it interesting that people believe that I am calling Canadians racist. And I think that's a heck of a lot of projection. There's a little bit of guilt inside of their hearts. But what I will say is that the way to have this conversation is not to call people racist, because you're trying to have this conversation on your own turf, whether or not it's okay to be racist, whether or not having pessimistic feelings about immigration is racist. That doesn't matter. In terms of mobilizing the vote, and helping people understand what their material interests are, that doesn't matter whatsoever. I don't want to have conversations about whether or not people are racist. Frankly, I don't care. What's important in these kinds of conversations is to, properly frame the context. Why is it that people are immigrating here? What is it that's causing the conflicts that drives them into Western nations in the first place? That's one. Two, apply proper historical context. When people say things like, you don't see white people moving into African nations or South American nations and so forth, how would they react? But why are they all coming here? Except that white people did move into these nations, which caused the problem in the first place, and they still are trying to benefit from the ability to economically exploit them in the present day. And they're coming here not to invade, but because they're trying to escape catastrophic conditions. So applying the proper historical context helps. And then three, attack them on their own terms, in terms of jobs, the economy, etc. If you say to people, you're racist for not letting immigrants in, then you're not going to move the needle at all. Nobody cares. But if you say to people, actually, if we close the borders tomorrow and stop letting immigrants in, well, here's what's going to happen. Businesses are going to pull up stakes, taxes are going to go up, A, B, C, X, Y, Z. If you have those kinds of conversations, now you've taken the plank out from underneath them by which they can use to attack you. If you start arguing on their terms, it makes a hell of a lot more sense, and I think will change a lot more minds than trying to have these weather vane conversations on whether or not people are racist. It's completely not productive. It doesn't help. You might already know that they're racist, but I don't think anybody else cares. You have to get them to understand how to vote in their own interest, and I think that's what's lacking in political conversations right now.
Excellent. If people want to get in touch with you, how can they do that?
My Twitter is, if you want to put it in the chat, at Andray Domise, and you can reach me, Andray at andraydomise.com.
Excellent. Well, I know you've got to get going, so I'll make it right quick. I'd like to thank everyone who was in on the conversation. Luke, Ryan, Bobby, Kinte, Nintendo, Badges, and also Fraser. And Ryan is saying Andray has great points. Ryan is based in Alberta, by the way. He's the only Canuck that's in on this conversation. Everyone else. Oh, Luke is too. Luke is from Windsor.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I saw Luke say that immigrants pay CPP and UI too.
Yeah, UI too.
Yeah,
exactly.
And also people who immigrate. I mean, they not only do they do that, they tend to be better educated than people who are born in Canada. They tend to actually, so when people immigrate here and they're not able to find jobs, they're actually more likely to become entrepreneurial. They'll start their own businesses faster. Actually, in the Black community, this is a well-known aspect. The Black community actually has the widest gap in terms of employment when they immigrate to Canada, but they're also the fastest rising demographic of entrepreneurs. So make of that what you will. They pay taxes, they pay into CPP, they pay into employment insurance, and they also consume things. So that adds to the tax base. So, it's like just to have those kinds of conversations that make sense and less conversations about whether or not people are racist. I think that's productive.
Excellent. And just for those people who are outside of Canada, CPP is the Canada Pension Plan. UI is unemployment insurance. Just
we have EI now, employment insurance. We don't.
Yes, employment insurance, not UI. EI.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to wrap it up quick. Thanks for everyone to stop by. I hope I included badges. I want to make sure. And I am Dr. Vibe, host and producer of the award-winning Dr. Vibe show, the home of Epic Conversations, and I'm the host of Epic Conversations. If you want to catch replays of my Get Vocal conversations, you're right here, or you can catch them on my YouTube channel. Anything else, just go to the Dr. Vibe show, the DRVIBESHOW.com, and we will catch you soon. Like I always say, live your life as a dream. If you can dream it, you can make it. Also, sometimes you have to get smaller to get stronger. Block assumptions, and that comes very much into this line of conversation. And I've got one last thing I just got to give you quickly before we close out. I know Andray's time is tick-tocking quick. Aim bigger, aim better, aim higher, aim wider. Thank you so much, and follow me to catch future conversations. God bless, peace be well, and keep the faith.
Take it easy.